listening to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam. Welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. Today we're joined by Rebecca Godfrey, who is the author of The Leadership Vaccine. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello, thanks for having me.
We are very excited to have Rebecca with us. I just recently read her book, The Leadership Vaccine. I read it on a couple of flights to the US. And for me, the very surprising thing was how much it resonated with, frankly, my day-to-day life and experiences in life sciences. So I'm so excited that you accepted to join an episode of our show, Rebecca.
Oh, no, thank you. I loved getting your email because I've been looking into your podcast and it's a really interesting series. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, just to get us started on the topic for today, which will be transforming specialists into leaders. Setting the stage, can you tell us a little bit more about how you came to write The Leadership Vaccine?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, just to be clear, I never saw myself as being an author. I always was very much like, I'm a scientist, so I'm not a writer of anything other than kind of scientific research. But a few years ago, I was working as a self-employed consultant. And as part of one of the bids, a contact who I was working with said that the potential client was looking for a case study of, how had I made some of the changes that I'd made throughout my career? Because I think I kind of built this career, as this reputation, should I say, as somebody to either come in to fix or come in to build. And so I kind of went away and really thought about how do I explain this? And I started to think about my various different roles and what we'd done. And because whilst we'd made really significant change or been able to build something really, fantastic, it never seemed that difficult. It always seemed quite natural. So I went away and started to think about each of the roles and break it down, just sitting in my office, sitting on the floor of my office, writing on cards. What did we do in this role? We did X, Y, and Z. And in this role, we did A, B, and C. And it was really bizarre because as I started to look, a pattern kind of evolved that there were the same 5 elements that were covered in different orders. And it was always when the 5th of those different pillars, as I now call them, clicked in, suddenly everything worked. And that's where it came up with this methodology, which covers culture, scope, structure, staff development, and process excellence. And so for a while, I was thinking and talking about this overall concept. But it wasn't until I actually went on an entrepreneur accelerator and one of the sessions was taken by a book publisher who came up to me and said, why don't you write a book? You've had this fantastic career. You've managed to make all of these changes. Why don't you write a book? And I thought, me, never. And it was through her persistence, my publisher's persistence to say, you've got a story in there, you need to write it. And through working with her and her team, that's when they said, well, you always talk in stories, you illustrate everything with stories. Why don't you write it as the story of a leader? And so that's kind of how it came about. And still to this day, 3 years after publishing it, it still feels weird to call myself an author, but it was such an enjoyable process. And also what's great is when you hear from people who've read it, who've said, oh, I see myself in this character or that character, which is fantastic because it's actually not based on any individual person. It's just a composite of my experiences and what I've observed throughout the industry.
Now, Rebecca, there are not many books out there that specifically focus on the experience of leadership in life sciences. How would you say the state of leadership is in life sciences?
I think it's really, really improving. I think for a long time, if I go back, 10 years or more ago, I think we had a lot of senior leaders that had been promoted because they were amazing scientists, amazing technicians, amazing medical physicians, but hadn't really been developed into leaders. I do think that is changing. I think there's much more of a focus on leadership development in our industry. But I think what's really unique about our industry and the other highly regulated industries is we have the common challenges that all leaders have: firefighting, stretched resources. I think if you speak to any leader, they'll say we don't have enough time, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough money. But also what we've got in our industry, which is the whole addition to that, is this regulated environment where we have these conflicting priorities of the science versus the regulation versus the business versus the human side. And so we want to be able to have fantastically creative, inspired teams, but at the same time, we're working under quite restricted, stringent regulations. And I think that that's where it's a big challenge, but I think that's where when we do see good leadership in our industry, it's phenomenal because it's kind of thriving out of this quite challenging environment.
That is also one of the things that I appreciate in our industry, that because of the many constraints, you're really forced to think creatively about some of the problems.
Exactly.
Do you think that the struggles that leaders in our industry have, how would they compare to leaders in other industries? Are there some commonalities?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. So for a few years, I kind of went out on my own and worked with leaders around strategy and team development. And when I first went out there, it was very much, pharma and biotechnology. That was the industry that I knew. But what I found that I ended up working with a lot of people in the financial industry, with pensions, because actually, and that's why the book now is in highly regulated industries rather than just our industry, because actually there are similarities in those industries, highly technical roles, the degrees and the educational background that people come out with is highly technical and highly detailed and specific. And then these folks are evolving into leaders. So actually, I think across the highly regulated industries, there's more commonalities than people perhaps would expect. But also what was lovely in those years working, occasionally I'd work with people in a completely different industry, much more creative. I worked with one gentleman who was, he had an academy for dancers and for those that were looking to build dance companies, dance academies. And actually going and working with them, it also made me realize that sometimes we can be very strict on thinking, oh, this is just specific because we're scientists. And actually it can be a wider challenge. But I definitely think that the regulatory side of things in our industry also, if you're working in a large organization, you've got the national and the global, you've got all of these conflicting priorities. I think the regulatory aspect of what we do is coupled with the very technical subject matter does bring a specific challenge for us.
Rebecca, we interestingly, we had a guest on our podcast a couple of weeks ago. We actually haven't released the episode yet, but he's a leader in this space, and he took quite a bold move to essentially reshuffle his cabinet, is how I would describe it. He had domain experts leading specific domain groups, but he decided, look, I want to take them out of their comfort zones, and they still remain leaders, but I want to put them in charge of a domain that they don't have direct expertise in. What's your thoughts about that as an approach? And is that something you've encountered in the past?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I have throughout my career. I remember early in my career, I was always really surprised that somebody would be the head of regulatory one minute and then the head of clinical development. And I think, gosh, how have they got expertise in both? And you then look at the person's LinkedIn, you'd realize they've moved all around. I think that is a really interesting approach. And I would say mainly because it means that individual is focused on how am I going to lead these individuals, as opposed to how am I going to do their job with them. So in my last role, so I'm a COO of a biotech startup now. I was a COO of a health tech startup before. And we had what we called technical line managers and pastoral line managers. So I line managed most of the company. I had video games developers, tech leads, product developers, data engineers reporting to me. And I focused on their development plans, their personal development, any personal issues that they had, looking at their workload, in collaboration with their technical lead. So they would come to me for things around them as an individual within their career. And then they would go to their technical line manager about, how do I do this? I need to learn more about this. And it worked really well because myself and their technical line manager worked very, very closely and worked very cohesively together. So I think it's really interesting when you have a line manager that isn't going to give you the answers, But if that line manager is comfortable in their leadership skin and can say, right, I don't have the answer for you, but tell me what you think you're going to do. Sometimes you just need a sounding board to say, based on the rationale you've given, that sounds like a sound approach. But also, especially if that domain expert is leading people who have a degree of expertise, they're going to answer the question for themselves because they're going to hear what they're saying. So I think it's a radical approach, and I think it's a really strong one, as long as the people in that domain do have somebody that they can go to. Now, in startups, sometimes each person is the expert in their area. So you're never going to necessarily be managed by somebody with an expert in your area because everyone is their mini expert. So again, it's having that leadership to be like, right, we're here together. It's not all on you. So I quite like the sound of that.
Yeah, no, we thought it was really interesting. And the other thing that he talked about in terms of some of his objectives of taking that approach was trying to get that leadership team to collaborate more, because the leaders didn't have domain expertise, but their colleagues did, because and the reshuffle effect meant that they'd have to lean on each other's expertise and therefore collaborate more too, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. And I think when you've got a strong leadership team, that's where, the leadership teams I've had the pleasure to work on, now and in the past few years, there's a real shared responsibility. If there is a challenge or a big event coming up, a product launch, an audit, an inspection, whatever's happening, it's always been very much like, we're in this together. How can we help? As opposed to, oh, well, it's a shame that's happening over your side of the fence. And I think that really lends to that. And having the opportunity, like for me, it was great development as a leader because I was the chief operating officer of the company, but I had a really good understanding of what we did because I spoke to the people on a regular basis in depth about what they were doing. So absolutely, I think at a leadership level, it builds that respect and understanding for each other's roles, definitely.
It's also very equivalent to a trend we're seeing in organizing technology organizations of both internal IT organizations, but also technology organizations more broadly, that will split the leadership role into, you can say, technical or functional leadership, people leadership, and then team leadership, where you have the Scrum Master role, which you'd see in software development. And it's funny to me that it's actually also a development that you're seeing in the biotechs that you have been working in.
And I think also, something that I'm very, very passionate about is just being a line manager shouldn't be your only opportunity to progress, because I love line management. It is what gets me out of bed. It is, I think back to my first ever direct report back in 2010. I'm still good friends with her. And I remember when I first took that on being really quite scared, because somebody gave me advice when I left a very early position. I was going to become a project manager, and they said, Rebecca, good luck in your new career. If I can give you one bit of advice, if you're a bad colleague, you can ruin somebody's day. If you're a bad manager, you can ruin their life. Good luck. And I was like, oh, great. Thanks for that. But actually, you can, if you are not great at line management, it can have a really big impact on not only somebody's work life, but somebody's whole life. And it's something that I take really seriously. Now, over the years, I've also had such enjoyment through seeing people grow and through having the lovely opportunity to play a very small part in somebody's, career journey. But also there's been times where it's been really hard, where line management, I've had a big, long to-do list of things to do, but actually line management's taken up 90% of my week because something has happened that week and the week after and the week after. If I didn't have a internal, intrinsic passion for line management, those weeks would be really miserable, rather than I understand the value I'm bringing. I understand the importance. This might be an uncomfortable situation, but I have to get through this, for the benefit of the people I'm leading. But I think, again, 10 or more years ago, we had a lot of people who were in line management, not because they were interested in being line managers, they just wanted to progress. So I think now this split of different roles means that, my husband, is very senior in his role. Throughout his whole career, he's not been a line manager. He has been a leader of people. He has led projects. He's an expert in his area, but he hasn't dealt with the day-to-day line management as I have, but that hasn't stopped his progression at all. And I think that's fantastic that companies are recognizing that, because otherwise what we do is we are promoting people into roles that, aren't for them, aren't what they enjoy, or we are stopping people from progressing one way or the other. And I think now there's a lot more senior individual contributors that are playing this matrix. Like you talk about the Scrum Master, they're fantastic at motivating and coordinating and mentoring people. But, they're focusing very much on the project rather than on the individual people and people issues.
We might be going a little off piste here, Rebecca. But what's your view on like the player coach scenario, where you've got like somebody who is effectively the manager, line manager, but they're also doing the same job as the team? Do you think that works, or do you think there's kind of a conflict there?
I don't think so. I've had many conversations with friends over the years who have said things to me like, oh, you can't be friends with people that report to you. And what they mean is you can't be on friendly terms. I'd never have lunch with people who report to me. And I think, goodness me, that must be a very lonely existence. Here in my current company, we all have lunch together every day. It's brilliant. As somebody who got into a really bad habit of not taking lunch breaks, it has really put me, and now I live for the lunch breaks, and we catch up and talk about, just the world and the weather. And I've also had it where people have struggled where they are peers as well as leaders. But for me, I think it's always come down to a mutual respect. I'm not into hierarchy. Yes, absolutely. As a senior leader, when push comes to shove, my shoulders are here to take any difficulties, any challenges, things like that. And I am very protective of my team. But, when all the positive and the success come in, that's all the team. That's not me. But I would hate to be the kind of leader that you walk into a room and it all suddenly goes quiet. You want to very much be part of the team. And I think it's about the leadership mindset. For me, I always say I'm of service to my team, especially as a COO. So much of what I do is enabling other people to be able to do parts of their job. So I think, again, if you have that mutual respect and you're not coming in and, being overbearing and, I'm your manager and the word boss is bandied around, and you're actually understanding what is my role as a line manager. I'm no more important than you. I just have a different set of responsibilities. Then I think it can work very, very well. Because like in my last role, any of those team members could have said, why am I going to have one-to-ones with you? You don't understand what I do. You're not a tech person. But it wasn't about that. It was saying, just really clarifying what I'm here to do, what I'm here to support and to provide, and also to continuously ask for feedback both ways. So I think if you have that, then it doesn't really matter where your role is, or even what your subject matter of expertise is.
But Rebecca, what if you have a strong specialist who really sees themselves as a people leader eventually? How would you develop them? How would you move them a little bit closer to achieving that goal?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, firstly, often people who are interested in leadership have throughout their career naturally gathered experience, whether it be, signing themselves up as a trainer. So before I was a manager, I was a technical trainer at a pharma company. They've done mentoring. Now there's so many different mentoring schemes out there, or they've just been that person that people naturally go to because they've got that way about them. So first and foremost, I would explore with them what they actually have already been doing to really highlight that they're building those skills. Now, if they haven't had the opportunity to do that, or they haven't realized that those opportunities were there, I'd start by looking at something like that. So for example, when new starters join in any company I've ever worked in, I've always proposed that we have a new starter buddy, somebody that spends time with that person, checks in with that person, makes sure that person knows where things are. I always say it's much easier for an existing staff member to reach out to a new person than the other way around. So if somebody early on in their career is talking about being interested in line management, things like that can be a first in of having that responsibility and having to think about somebody other than yourself. And I think it's that journey, as opposed to somebody, leaving somebody who says they want line management and thinking, oh, I'll go and send them on a course at some point. The course is only going to do so much. Like, you can read a book, you can watch, there's so many resources available. It's really, how can we give these folks the experience of having a responsibility towards somebody else, and being a mentor, being a buddy can be a great way of doing that. But also, as I say, actually exploring what they've already started to gather. Then you can, of course, the courses, the online resources, books, and all of that bolster that, and making sure that somebody is showing that interest and is showing that appetite to learn. If somebody was saying to me they wanted to be a line manager, but they weren't really going to look for anything or to take on any, I would then be very open with them and challenge them. Like, can I just ask, why are you interested in becoming a line manager? And that's not coming from a place of judgment, but what is it? And often if somebody will say, it'll look good on my CV, or I really feel it's the next stage, sometimes giving people permission to say, well, actually, I just want to progress. I don't necessarily want to be a line manager. I just want to progress. And we can say, okay, well, could we look at other ways that you could progress? Because quite frankly, nobody wants to be a line manager for the sake of it. And sometimes they may not realize it, especially if they've come from a previous company or an industry where they're so used to seeing progression include line management.
Yeah. What about this whole like management versus leadership concept? People talk about like being a leader isn't necessarily being a manager and vice versa. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about that?
I think they're very different roles. They can be the same roles. So for example, here in my company, I have one direct report. I'm the COO. Most of our team are scientists. Now, I'm a scientist by background. I did a PhD, so I understand what they're doing, not to the extent. It's been a while. I think it's 17 years since I finished my PhD. It's been a while. But I provide leadership across a variety of different topics that involve all of the team in some instances, some of the team, sometimes nobody in the team, maybe just myself. So I think leadership is around kind of what you're bringing in terms of the value. So leading an organization, making those decisions for an organization, providing that wider support. Line management to me is something that I think can be in some instances a lot more tangible insofar as, you have the one-to-ones, you'd be involved in the appraisals, things like that. Now, somebody said to me, a friend of mine said to me, you can't tell anyone you're a leader. Leader is not somebody that people are told to follow. People just naturally do. And that's where you can often spot leadership potential in somebody who might not be a manager, somebody who might be an amazing scrum master, somebody who might be an amazing project director, somebody that people love to collaborate with. And they may say, I love to collaborate with as long as it's on the topic. I'm not really down for helping somebody with a personal problem. And I'd rather somebody say that to me than take that role and then not want to help somebody with a personal problem. So that's where line management for me is very much a role with a job description. Leadership can be at all levels.
Yeah.
In a company the size of ours, I would say that every single person here is showing and demonstrating leadership on a day-to-day basis, either because they're the expert in their own area, or they're bringing something. One of our most junior people here has come straight in, and she's bringing something to the table in terms of an approach that we're all learning from. In that, guys, she's providing leadership there, thought leadership. So leadership is much more, for me, intangible, whereas management more tangible, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense. I think the whole kind of topic of trying to influence without having authority as well is something that I've kind of had to deal with in the professional capacity when I've not been in a management position, but due to the nature of work, you've had to collaborate with a wide number of different functional groups within an organization to get a job done. There can be a real challenge sometimes, right? If you don't have that kind of level of seniority, but you still have to influence peer groups and other people working within the organization.
Definitely. And, my first management position in inverted commas was actually project management. I didn't have any direct reports, and it meant it was difficult because if there was a performance issue on my project, I remember thinking, gosh, am I telling tales? I have to go to their line manager and deal with this. Over the course of my career, now I've realized that even if I'm not somebody's line manager, I can share feedback just like anyone can share feedback to me. I always, when I started at this company and in all previous companies, I'll always say to people, I welcome any feedback, especially because I'm often the person like rolling out structures and processes. Like you want to hear if people are thinking, oh goodness, here she comes again with another process. But I say, I welcome feedback. The only feedback I don't like is the feedback I don't hear. So if you ever feel like you can't come to me, you can go to our CEO, you can go to one of my peers. I'll never be upset because I understand that sometimes it's really difficult. And actually, it doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with you. Sometimes the hardest people to feedback are the people that you get on really well with. So over the course of my career, I've realized that actually, if you are leading a project and you've got a concern or an issue, you don't have to go to their line manager. You can just have a conversation, because if we all stopped and thought about it, we would welcome the conversation with us. But certainly when you've not had line management, I think it can be particularly difficult. But also it depends on the organization. I have worked in one organization where I was leading a cross-functional team, and line managers of some of the people in that cross-functional team would undermine, or you'd have a conversation and you'd be on the same page, and then suddenly they jump off the page. And then that leads the poor team member in a little bit of no man's land. So I think, again, it all comes down to culture. In a positive, good working culture, all of these different structures, line management styles work beautifully. And I think for those of us who are leaders, tangible or intangibly, those of us who are leaders and who, feel comfortable to be able to raise when something's not working. And I say this in the book, it's important that we say the right thing, which might not always be the popular thing. So sometimes I've had to say, guys, I just don't feel this is working. And people might be like, what? And deep down, somebody out there, at least one or two people is going, oh, thank goodness somebody said it. But to say, oh, I don't think this is working. How can we? Or is there, I'm trying to lead and I feel like I don't really have you on board. How can we work this out? If you feel that you're not getting that respect from somebody because you're not their line manager.
I think you're right about the culture aspect as well, because to be able to do that, Rebecca, I think people have to feel safe, that it's a safe environment to be able to speak up and be confident about saying when they don't agree, and not just say yes to everything. I wanted to bring it back to the book, The Leadership Vaccine. And you started by talking about how you went about writing this book. I've got a mental image of you sat on the floor with all of these cards, scribbling down ideas. You touched upon the 5 pillars that really underpin the narrative of the book. Could you go into a bit more detail about those 5 pillars for our listeners, please? Yeah,
absolutely. So the 5 pillars are culture, scope, structure, staff development, and process excellence. So where it starts with culture is just fundamentally, what are we here to do? Like, what is this ship, our business, or our team, built for? So it's looking at the big, hairy, audacious goal, the vision. And I've worked in startups. I've worked with many startups as a consultant, helping companies develop their vision. But I've also worked in in-house teams where you need that vision, because again, on the tough days where you're thinking, goodness me, my to-do list is so long, like having that anchor to be like, yeah, but this is what we're here to do. And this is where we are so lucky in our industry, because you don't have to look far to really understand the value and purpose that we all have in our roles. I write about this in the beginning of the book. I have always been passionate about, providing life-changing solutions to patients, but it wasn't until my own father was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, where there is no solution, that it crystallized why I do what I do. Everything about my job is efficiency, making things smooth and easy so that we can get our treatments to patients quicker, but also so that the people I work with can come in and do a great job and not have overly cumbersome, mechanisms that they have to work with, because they have lives too. Because I know when my dad was sick, I had to go and do a really good job, day's work, but I also had to keep energy for home. So for me, my vision, because of that personal experience, is so clear. But together as a team or together as an organization, if you can have that, what's our hairy, audacious goal? What's that big flash out in the future that we want to achieve? Now that's all well and good, but that can seem a little bit like pie in the sky if we don't have something to then pull that back down to earth. And that's the mission. So the big, hairy, audacious goal, what are we here to do? The mission is, what are we going to do every day to get there? And the example I often give is one that I came up with one of my teams a few years ago, where it was we in the compliance team put in place the checks and balances so that you, the physicians and scientists, when you're reviewing your data, can be assured that it's robust, complete and accurate. And it's very much around, what's the approach that you take? Who is it you serve? And what's the transformation you're looking to make? Every single presentation we went into, I'd say, hi, I'm Rebecca from the compliance team. We in the compliance team put in place the checks and balances. That was really important because I inherited an organization that was very much, we're the compliance team, we're here to like police you. And it was a way of turning it around in us, because all in the team, we were very clear that we were of service. And we were putting these things in place, not to be difficult, but to catch you if you fall and to give you reassurance. So that is really, really fundamental for a team coming together of what are we here to achieve? And that mission may evolve over time, especially if you're in a startup, because what you're really looking to do in the next year or 2 or 3 might be different to what you're doing in years 4, 5 and beyond. So you know where you're going now. The next thing is, what are you actually going to do, which is scope. In a startup, often you will have an absolute feast of opportunities. And if you try and do all of them, you're going to do none. So you really want to be like, what are we going to focus on first? And this was something I learned in the Entrepreneur Accelerator. It was actually after I'd come up with the 5 pillars, but it really kind of, this line was, your target market isn't your only market. So for me, when I was a consultant going out and working with teams, my target market was biotech and pharma. But because when I spoke to somebody in biotech and pharma, I spoke to their heart, to their gut, because I'd been there, I knew their pain. But by doing that, I also had, as I said, finance, pensions, the tech world all coming out. Hang on a sec, that sounds familiar and helpful. But I was really clear on what I was here to do. In an in-house team, I've had teams where they go, oh, I don't know if that's us or if that's the other team, or, oh, we're still doing this, but, in the restructure, it was meant to move to another team. And there becomes a real lack of clarity around what your day-to-day here to do. So you're trying to do a million things instead of doing fewer really, really well. Also, especially if you're in a large company, when you get to the edge of that scope, you're like, is this me or is that the other team? Or is this me or is this you? You slow down and you get in what I call scope paralysis, where either you're stepping on each other's toes and duplicating it, or you're being so polite not to step on each other's toes that there's a gaping chasm. So you kind of culture, you know where you're going, scope, you know what you're doing. Then structure is who does what. And I'm not talking about structure in terms of like an org chart, more in terms of mindset. And that's all about distributing control, getting subject matter experts in the right place, right skills, right role. It goes back to my consulting days very early on, where I remember getting told off as a project manager for filing. So they were like, you're a very expensive person to do filing. And I thought I was being helpful. But it's really, about making sure that we're, making the most of all the incredible skills and knowledge and experience we've got. And actually, somebody who might be, somebody with 1 or 2 years experience may have a completely different perspective. So I'm a big one about, delegate and distribute as much as you can, because if it's all in my hands and all in my head and something happens to me, that's not very resilient for the business. So you know where you're going, you know what you're doing, you know who does what, then you can get to the staff development. And that's where we look at developing not only the skills, knowledge, and experience of our teams, but also their confidence. And that comes very much down to how you manage the individuals. So if in your structure piece, you're saying, do you know what, Sam would be great. He's not quite there yet, but I'd love him to lead this. We can then in that staff development say, right, what are the skills, knowledge and experience he needs? But also, how do we create a safe space for him to try and build that confidence? Because what we really want is empowered individuals who have a real sense of purpose as to why we're here. They know what we're here to do now. They are aware of the 25 million things we could be doing, but they know what they're doing now. They feel respected and involved and inspired by the fact that they're not just, a cog in somebody else's machine. And then we're looking not only on, okay, we'll keep training you. But if somebody doesn't have that confidence, we need to get to that place where like, go and try it, come back, and I want to see what you would do. So one of my colleagues who's quite junior, I'll say, oh, this is the kind of thing I'm thinking. Do you want to go away and kind of think about it and mock something up and come back, rather than me saying, do this, this, and this? Because once you've got highly confident, highly skilled individuals with that ownership and that intrinsic drive around what we're here to do, then you've got process excellence, because they will build your processes. And rather than having a leader or a domain head or a line manager or a team leader say, right, I'm going to write all the processes, you've got the team writing them, which means that firstly, they'll have better ownership, because it won't be, oh, this process from Rebecca is rubbish. It'll be, they might say, my own process is rubbish, I need to improve it. But they'll be following something that makes sense and that they've got that, involvement. And also it'll be a better process because they know, the people who are doing the role are the people who really know how it should be described. And in a lot of the big pharma companies, the SOPs are the most unreadable things you've ever read in your life. So you want these processes to be really good, like built by the users for the users. But also you've now got an army of people who are empowered to look out and see changes in regulation, changes in the environment. And it's not just oh, Rebecca, did you hear the, regulations changing and me adding it to my list? I can be like, right, can we get these three folks together? And that's very much how I've had to work. My first management position, the only two colleagues I had at the time were graduates without a life science degree with no experience in pharmacovigilance where we worked. I needed them to come on board and say, can you read this with me and just see your interpretation? And obviously I took the responsibility as the senior person, but I also wanted to hear how they would interpret things with the fresh pair of eyes. And that's kind of how it goes. And as I say, when I was writing the book and I had all those cards, sometimes it would come in different orders, but it was when the fifth thing clicked in and everyone knew, and it was like everyone on a sprint, on a track, they're in their lines, they know where they are, they know where their scope is of the team, of the company, but also of their own role. They had that responsibility and everyone just ran. And, I make it sound like I didn't have loads of failures and challenges along the way. Of course, there were some horrendous days along the way. It all sounds great now. But ultimately, over time, even now, when I'm like, oh, this feels difficult, I'm like, okay, it's because we're not quite there across these 5 pillars. So every so often I'll go back and look at the contents page of the book and go, what am I missing out? Okay, we've not got there yet, or I'd forgotten that bit. But time and time again, it seems to work pretty well.
That was a great summary of the 5 pillars there. And what I've found in some organizations is people are very good at painting the vision part, but it's like the execution after that is where things tend to fall apart. And people then, to some of the points that you talk to, people get distracted by the next shiny object to go and chase. And then all of the other work that should be happening just falls by the wayside. So I like the structure and sort of rigor behind what you described there.
And that was so that the word vaccine, the letters, so stand for the methodology. And the last one really talks about constantly evaluating and making sure that we do, once you've got those 5 pillars in place, just like we do with our team members where we have mid and end year appraisals, we should be doing that. And how is our team working? What's working right? Because if you look back to the Tuckman model from the 60s of, the forming, storming, norming, performing, they talk about every time somebody leaves a team or a new team member joins, it's a new team. So you go back into that. It's really important that when we're setting up teams and when we do all of this work, that we do an ongoing evaluation so that every so often you can just adjust rather than leaving it. And it's like trying to turn the Titanic. So that's also something that's really important. And also, I have to admit, I wrote that book when I was out helping other people do this. I've now spent 3 years back in house doing it myself. Now, it's quite difficult when you've written a book and then you're doing it yourself. You suddenly are like, how much of a hypocrite am I being because I've not had time to do something? Or have I been doing good one-to-ones? Have I been doing this? Especially when your team has read your book. And so I always say to them, like, especially when somebody goes, oh, I read your book over the weekend. I'm like, what's the bit that I'm not doing? It's really hard to do. It's not easy to do. And, when people go on a week-long course and they're learning all of this in a week, I say, no, don't. This should take a year. So if somebody was reading my book again, rather than read it on a couple of flights, I would say read 1 chapter and then wait. Think about that, implement that. Then in a month later, read another chapter. Because if you read the book, I visit Tom each month. So actually, I think you'd be pretty dedicated to still be reading my book in a year. But I would rather somebody kind of read, the chapter, take you not very long at all, and then implement that and then read something else, because otherwise it can feel really overwhelming. And I think a lot of these 2, 3, 4, 5-day leadership courses are overwhelming because you've spoken about the culture, and by lunchtime on Monday, you're like, all right, I'm going to do this vision, I'm going to do this mission. That's great. And then by Friday, you're like, right, okay, I'm going to do an inventory of all of our tasks and put them into like the different categories that Rebecca talks about in that one. You've forgotten about the culture by that point. So I think it can be really difficult. And as I say, I constantly go back and look and go, what haven't I done?
No, I totally agree with that. From my experience, I like to sort of let things percolate inside internally and digest all of the information over a period of time rather than just take everything on board. Way more effective that way.
Definitely.
Well, I would like to ask you a question that we always ask our guests. And that is, if we gave you a magic wand and this magic wand gave you one wish that would transform something in the life science industry, what would you pick to transform?
I would like to transform. And again, I feel like a lot of my wishes I'm seeing come true. So some of this is already happening, but really well-being to be at the front and foremost, employee well-being. I think in our industry, because we have this really clear guiding light of our patients, what I often say is we have to remember that the people working in our industry are people too. And we don't know what they're going through. I was lucky when, that awful time between my dad's diagnosis and when we finally lost him, I had an amazing team and we were doing incredible work and being really well recognized, but we also really enjoyed working with each other. Myself and my direct reports in that time, we still have lunches. We're due one next month and have an absolute hoot. We'd a really good culture, and it allowed me, as I say, the time and space to deal with, the things that I was going through. But I do still see that sometimes this drive for the patient is I don't want to say used, because I don't think people are realizing they're doing it, but I know I did it on myself. I was working longer and longer and longer hours because I was like, but this is so important. These people, if we don't get this, but we're never going to get the value to our patients if we don't look after ourselves. Everyone here has coaching, unlimited coaching across a variety of different topics. It's really important. And more companies are doing that now, not just for the C-suite people, but, coaching and well-being and different kinds of, support for folks. Here we don't, we have a culture of, let's come in and do productive work. There's no kind of awards for working the longest hours or anything like that. As a leader, I try to set a good example by not working all hours, because if I do it, I can't expect other people, they might think, well, Rebecca says not to do it, but she's doing it. So I think well-being, if we can continue to see the little improvements we're seeing, that it's not just lip service, that there is genuine support available for people, but most importantly, that leaders and line managers are really promoting, come in, do a great day's work, and then go off and have a fabulous evening where you've got energy for friends, family, activities, whatever you want, TV, whatever you want. And I think that is something, that I really, really hope we continue to do.
That makes a lot of sense. And tying that to the leadership and being able to understand where you're at and how you are going to develop next, I think nurturing yourself is a very important aspect in that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Rebecca, this has been a really interesting conversation that I wish could go on for much longer. But if our listeners want to reach out to you and ask you any follow-up questions, where would they be able to find you?
LinkedIn. I'm probably on LinkedIn far too much. But yeah, LinkedIn, you can find me there. Rebecca Godfrey, PhD on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on our show.
No, thank you so much again for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendal on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.